In the quiet town of Riverstone, Virginia, a 90-year-old woman, Eleanor Carter has seen it all: war, loss, and a lifetime of resilience. But when a ruthless biker gang threatens her small town, they make one fatal mistake: underestimating her. A decorated Vietnam War veteran and one of the first female helicopter pilots, Eleanor isn't about to back down. With one simple phone call, she sets off a chain of events that leaves the bikers stunned and the town rallying behind their unsung hero. Packed with suspense, heart, and a powerful message, this is the story of a legend who refuses to be forgotten. Welcome back. Before we start, remember to hit the like and subscribe for new stories every day. The morning light spilled across the worn leather of Eleanor Carter's riding gloves as she eased her aging hands into them. At 90 years old, her fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but they still remembered the controls of a Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter with startling precision. Some memories, she had discovered, lived not in the mind but in the muscles and bones. She glanced at the photograph on her bedside table, a faded image of herself standing proudly beside her helicopter in Vietnam, the call sign Valkyrie emblazoned on its side. Beside it sat a newer frame containing a picture of her late husband Robert and their German shepherd, Scout, both gone now. The house felt emptier without Scout's padding footsteps and watchful presence. The old veteran dog had been her constant companion for 14 years after Robert passed, until last winter when Scout's arthritic body finally surrendered to time. "Just you and me now, old girl," Eleanor murmured to herself as she picked up her keys. Her Riverstone home had grown quiet in recent years, but she refused to let solitude diminish her independence. Tuesday mornings meant grocery shopping and filling up her vintage Ford truck at Miller's gas station on the edge of town. Eleanor, Ellie to those who knew her well, had lived in Riverstone, Virginia, for nearly 40 years. The small town had welcomed her and Robert when they returned from the war, a place where they could heal from what they'd seen and done. Now, she was one of the town's eldest residents, a living repository of stories and wisdom that few took the time to seek anymore. She eased the truck into Miller's gas station just as the spring sun crested the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. The station was unusually busy for a Tuesday, and Ellie immediately noticed the cluster of motorcycles parked near the convenience store entrance, sleek, black machines with chrome accents that gleamed menacingly in the morning light. As she began pumping gas, Ellie felt the weight of unwanted attention. Three men in black leather vests emblazoned with a serpent logo emerged from the store, eyes locking onto her with predatory interest. The tallest of them, a man with a shaved head and a thick beard streaked with gray, sauntered over, stopping uncomfortably close. "Nice truck, Grandma," he said, running a tattooed hand along the hood of her meticulously maintained 1969 Ford F-100. "Bit much for someone your age, don't you think?" Ellie continued pumping gas, her expression unchanging. "It gets me where I need to go." The man leaned closer, his breath reeking of cigarettes and coffee. "Name's Havoc. My boys and I just moved into town. Shadow Vipers Motorcycle Club. You might be seeing a lot more of us around here." "Is that so?" Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the chill that ran down her spine. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of men she'd encountered in war, an emptiness masked by bravado. "This town's got potential," Havoc continued, gesturing broadly. "Sleepy little place like this, not much law enforcement. Perfect for our kind of business opportunities." The gas pump clicked off, and Ellie replaced the nozzle. "Riverstone's always been a peaceful community. We look after our own." Havoc laughed, a harsh sound that drew the attention of his companions, who moved closer. "Look around, Grandma. This place is dying. Half the storefronts on Main Street are empty. The young folks are leaving. Nobody's looking after anything. Except us old-timers," Ellie said, straightening her shoulders. "And what are you going to do? Bore us to death with war stories," sneered the youngest of the three, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck. Havoc placed a heavy hand on her truck door as she tried to open it. "Listen, lady. This town is changing hands. The Shadow Vipers are moving in. We've got plans, and nobody, especially not some ancient relic, is going to stand in our way." Ellie met his gaze with the steady calm that had once guided helicopters through enemy fire. "I suggest you remove your hand from my vehicle." The three men exchanged amused glances, and Havoc leaned in closer. "Or what?" You'll hit me with your purse. No, Ellie said, reaching slowly into her pocket. I'll make a phone call. She pulled out her cell phone, her arthritic fingers moving with deliberate precision as she pressed a single button, a speed dial. The bikers watched with mocking smiles as she put the phone to her ear. Charlie? It's Ellie Carter. I'm at Miller's gas station. 3 gentlemen from something called the Shadow Vipers are making me feel unwelcome. Her voice was conversational, almost pleasant. Yes, thank you, dear. See you soon. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue my day. Havoc snorted. What? You calling your grandson to come save you? No, Ellie replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Much more than that. Inside the convenience store, the cashier, a young woman named Tina, watched the confrontation with growing concern. She had known Ellie all her life. The older woman had been her history teacher before retiring. Tina's hand hovered over the phone, ready to call the police, when she heard it, the distant rumble of engines. The sound grew louder, filling the morning air with a thunderous chorus that caused Havoc and his companions to turn toward the road. A line of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, dozens of them, their engines growling like approaching thunder. Within minutes, the gas station was surrounded by motorcycles, not the sleek, menacing machines of the Shadow Vipers, but a diverse collection of Harleys, Indians, and Triumphs, many adorned with American flags and military insignia. Their riders, mostly men in their 60s and 70s with a few younger faces among them, dismounted with the practiced ease of those who had spent lifetimes on bikes. At their lead was a barrel-chested man in his 70s with a silver-streaked beard and a leather vest covered in military patches. He walked directly to Ellie, executed a perfect military salute, and then embraced her gently. Colonel Carter, he said, his voice carrying across the now-silent gas station. The Valkyries riders are at your service. Ellie returned the embrace. Thank you for coming so quickly, Charlie. Charlie Thompson turned to face Havoc and his suddenly less confident companions. I don't believe we've met. I'm Charlie Thompson, former Staff Sergeant, 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. The lady you were harassing? That's Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Carter, one of the first female helicopter pilots in Vietnam. She flew into hot landing zones that would make your nightmares seem pleasant, evacuating wounded soldiers when everyone else said it couldn't be done. He gestured to the gathering of bikers behind him. Every man and woman here either served with her, was saved by her, or knows someone who was. We're the Valkyries Riders, a veterans motorcycle club, and Riverstone has been our home for decades. Havoc's swagger had visibly diminished, but he made an attempt to maintain his composure. We don't want trouble with veterans. We respect service. But this town is changing, and business is business. Your kind of business isn't welcome here, Charlie replied firmly. Now, I suggest you and your friends leave, not just this gas station, but Riverstone. There are plenty of other towns where you might find less resistance. For a tense moment, it seemed Havoc might escalate the situation. His hand twitched near his waist, where the outline of something solid pressed against his leather jacket. But a quick assessment of the numbers, 3 against over 50, led to a swift reevaluation. This isn't over, Havoc muttered as he and his companions mounted their motorcycles. Nobody tells the Shadow Vipers where they can and can't go. As they roared away, Ellie turned to Charlie with a grateful smile. Thank you. I wasn't sure how many would come. Charlie laughed, the sound warming the spring air. For you, Colonel? Everyone would come. But we need to talk. These guys aren't just passing through. They've been scoping properties on the outskirts of town, asking questions about local businesses. Whatever they're planning, it's not a weekend visit. Ellie nodded, her expression growing serious. Then let's not wait for them to make the next move. I think it's time to resurrect our old tactical meetings. By sundown, the community center on Oak Street was filled with an unlikely war council. Around a large table sat 24 veterans ranging in age from 30 to 90, alongside Sheriff Davidson, Mayor Helen Porter, and several business owners from town. A large map of Riverstone and the surrounding county was spread across the table, with various locations marked in red. The Shadow Vipers have been seen here, and here, Sheriff Davidson said, pointing to the markers. They've rented the old McKenzie farm on Route 16, and they've been frequenting the Rusty Nail Bar on the county line. What do we know about them? Asked Mayor Porter, a stern woman in her 60s who had served as a military nurse. Charlie slid a folder across the table. They're not just rowdy bikers. The Shadow Vipers have connections to drug trafficking operations in 3 states. They move in, establish a base of operations, intimidate local businesses into paying protection money, and use the area as a distribution hub. They specifically target small towns with limited law enforcement resources. And now they've set their sights on Riverstone, Ellie said quietly. A younger veteran named Miguel Ramirez, who had served in Afghanistan and now owned the local auto repair shop, leaned forward. With all due respect, are we overreacting? 3 guys at a gas station is hardly an invasion. It starts small, Charlie replied. First, it's a few guys testing the waters. Then more arrive. Before you know it, they're everywhere, and people are too scared to speak up. Sheriff Davidson nodded. Charlie's right. I've been in touch with colleagues in Harrisonville and Clarkfield. Both towns saw the same pattern. A small group establishes a presence, then reinforcements arrive. Within months, they had drug problems, increased violence, and businesses closing because owners couldn't afford the protection fees. So what's our plan? Asked Susan Chun, a former Army intelligence officer in her 50s who now ran the local hardware store. We can't just form a vigilante group. No, Ellie agreed. But we can organize a community watch. Eyes and ears everywhere, reporting suspicious activity. We document everything, build a case for law enforcement. And we make it clear that Riverstone stands united. The problem, Sheriff Davidson interjected, is that I have exactly 4 deputies for the entire county. If the Shadow Vipers bring in reinforcements as they've done elsewhere, we'll be outnumbered. A thoughtful silence fell over the room until Miguel spoke again. What about Zeus? All eyes turned to a corner of the room where an imposing German shepherd lay quietly watching the proceedings. The dog's ears perked up at the mention of his name. Zeus is trained in drug detection, Miguel continued. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan before retiring. I adopted him last year when his handler was deployed again. He could help us identify if and where they're moving product. Ellie studied the shepherd, noting the intelligent alertness in his eyes that reminded her painfully of her own scout. Would he work with someone else? He's well trained, Miguel assured her. He'll follow commands from anyone who knows the right signals. Sheriff Davidson looked skeptical. And how exactly do we deploy a drug-sniffing dog without tipping our hand? We don't deploy him as law enforcement, Ellie said, an idea forming. We deploy him as a therapy dog. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. A therapy dog? Ellie nodded. Zeus can be registered as a community therapy dog. Many veterans already know the benefits of animal companionship for PTSD and other service-related issues. We can create a program. Visits to the senior center, the elementary school, veterans in need. It gives Zeus and his handlers legitimate reasons to be all over town. And if he happens to alert on something interesting during these visits, Charlie added with a smile. We call the sheriff. Ellie finished firmly. Everything by the book. We're not vigilantes. We're concerned citizens assisting law enforcement. Mayor Porter studied the map thoughtfully. It could work, but we need to be careful. These people aren't just troublemakers. They're dangerous criminals. So were the Viet Cong, Ellie said quietly. And we survived them. As the meeting continued into the night, a strategy took shape. The veterans would form the Veterans Guard, an organized community watch that would patrol the town in pairs, documenting Shadow Viper activities and protecting vulnerable businesses. Zeus would become the town's therapy dog, making regular rounds with different handlers. Meanwhile, Sheriff Davidson would coordinate with state police and FBI contacts to build a case. What none of them realized was that Tina, the cashier from Miller's gas station, had a younger brother named Jesse who occasionally hung out at the Rusty Nail. And Jesse, desperate for acceptance and cash, had already begun telling Havoc everything he knew about Riverstone's business owners, including which ones were most vulnerable to pressure. The battle for Riverstone had only just begun. The first attack came 3 days later. Miguel's auto repair shop was broken into overnight, tools stolen, customer vehicles vandalized, and a crude snake symbol spray painted on the main garage door. The message was clear. This was the Shadow Viper's response to the gas station confrontation. Sheriff Davidson documented the scene, but everyone knew there would be no immediate arrests. No witnesses, no cameras in that part of town, and the Vipers would have solid alibis. By the end of the week, 2 more veteran-owned businesses had been hit. Susan Chin's hardware store had its windows smashed, and the small-town diner, owned by former Navy cook Frank Williams, suffered a mysterious kitchen fire that investigators quickly determined was arson. They're targeting veterans specifically, Charlie noted grimly during an emergency meeting of the Veterans Guard. They know we're organized against them. Zeus lay at Miguel's feet, occasionally lifting his head when the tension in the room peaked. The German Shepherd had already begun his therapy dog rounds, wearing a vest that identified him as a service animal while he visited various locations around town. We need to step up our efforts, Ellie said. Miguel, has Zeus detected anything on his rounds? Miguel nodded. Twice. Once near the abandoned warehouse by the railroad tracks, and again at the motel on Highway 29. Sheriff Davidson did a drive-by of the warehouse, but couldn't establish probable cause for a search. The motel owner claims the room Zeus alerted on was vacant and being renovated. They're establishing distribution points, Susan said, her intelligence background evident in her analysis. The warehouse for storage, the motel for transactions. Classic cell structure. Sheriff Davidson looked tired. I've reached out to the DEA, but they're stretched thin. They've promised to send someone in the next 2 weeks. We don't have 2 weeks, Frank Williams interjected, his normally jovial face now creased with worry. Half my diner was destroyed. Insurance will cover it, but I had to lay off 3 people. If this keeps up, there won't be a town left to save. Ellie studied the map where they'd been tracking Shadow Viper sightings and incidents. A pattern was emerging. They were systematically targeting the eastern edge of town first, creating a corridor of fear from the highway to downtown. We need to understand their operation better, she said finally. Who their local contacts are, how they're moving product, where they're vulnerable. You're talking about intelligence gathering, Charlie said. Exactly. Ellie turned to the group. In Vietnam, we learned that you can't fight what you don't understand. We need eyes inside. Are you suggesting we infiltrate a drug gang? Sheriff Davidson asked incredulously. These aren't amateurs, Colonel Carter. They're dangerous criminals with connections to cartels. Not infiltrate, Ellie clarified. Observe. Listen, there must be locals they're recruiting, like those kids who hang around the Rusty Nail. Someone in town is talking to them, helping them understand our weaknesses. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room until Sharon Baker, a retired Army nurse who volunteered at the high school, spoke up. Jesse Miller, Tina's younger brother. He's been flashing cash lately, wearing new clothes. And he's been seen with some rough-looking characters at the skateboard park. Tina from the gas station? Charlie asked. The one who witnessed the confrontation with Havoc? Sharon nodded. Jesse's a good kid at heart, but troubled. Their father left years ago, and their mother works 2 jobs. He's exactly the kind of recruit they'd target. Local knowledge, needs money, wants to belong to something. Ellie considered this information. We need to talk to Jesse, but carefully. If the Vipers think he's been compromised, it could be dangerous for him and Tina. Let me handle it, offered Miguel. I've been mentoring kids like Jesse through the Veterans Outreach Program. I could approach him about a job at the shop, say I need help rebuilding after the vandalism. Ellie nodded. Good. In the meantime, we need to secure the businesses that haven't been hit yet. Charlie, can you organize security teams? Already on it, Charlie replied. We've got veterans taking shifts at every vulnerable location. They're armed but discreet. Sheriff Davidson looked uncomfortable. I hope you all understand my position here. I can't sanction armed patrols. We're not patrolling, Charlie clarified. We're private citizens protecting private property at the owner's request. Everything within the law, Sheriff. As the meeting concluded, Zeus suddenly stood at attention, his ears forward and body rigid. A low growl emanated from his throat as he stared at the community center's back door. Miguel immediately gave a hand signal, and Zeus fell silent, but remained alert. Someone's out there, he whispered. Charlie and 2 other veterans moved silently to different windows, peering carefully through the blinds. Sheriff Davidson unholstered his weapon and positioned himself near the door. Black motorcycle, far side of the parking lot, Charlie reported. 1 rider, watching the building. They're monitoring us, Susan said softly, cataloging who's involved. Ellie made a decision. Miguel, take Zeus out the front entrance, nice and visible. Act like you're just finishing a therapy session. Sheriff, you leave 5 minutes later, make it look routine. The rest of us will wait 15 minutes, then leave in different directions. Don't go directly home. Make sure you're not followed. As the veterans dispersed according to plan, Ellie remained behind with Charlie, studying the map. This is escalating faster than I expected, she admitted. Charlie nodded grimly. They're not just bullies, Ellie. They're organized criminals. And I'm worried about what comes next. What came next was worse than any of them anticipated. The following morning, a small explosion rocked Riverstone's Veterans Memorial Park, destroying the recently installed Vietnam War memorial that Ellie had helped fund. Though no one was injured, the message was unmistakable, a direct attack on the town's military heritage and a personal affront to Ellie herself. By sunset, reports indicated that the Shadow Vipers' numbers had swelled to over 20, with more arriving. The battle for Riverstone was entering a new phase, and Ellie knew they needed to adapt their strategy quickly before someone got hurt or worse. 2 weeks into what locals had begun calling the Riverstone Resistance, Zeus made a discovery that changed everything. During a scheduled visit to the town library, where he supposedly provided comfort to children during reading hour, the German Shepherd alerted strongly near a seldom-used reference section. Miguel, acting as his handler that day, casually investigated and found something tucked behind the County Land Survey archives, a small notebook filled with dates, locations, and code names. Within hours, the Veterans Guard leadership had convened at Ellie's house, away from potential surveillance at the community center. Sheriff Davidson carefully photographed each page of the notebook before returning it exactly where Zeus had found it. It's a dead drop, Susan explained as they reviewed the photographs. Old-school espionage technique. Someone is leaving information for someone else without direct contact. Can you decode it? Charlie asked, squinting at the cryptic entries. Susan studied the pages. Some of it. These look like shipment schedules. Quantities. Contact information encoded with a simple substitution cipher. She pointed to a series of numbers. And these are coordinates, locations within a 20-mile radius of Riverstone. Sheriff Davidson leaned forward. This could be the evidence we need. If we can connect this to the Shadow Vipers. We need to know who's using this dead drop, Ellie interrupted. Both sides, who's leaving information and who's picking it up. Miguel scratched Zeus behind the ears, rewarding him for his discovery. We could stake out the library, but they'd spot us immediately. Not if we use the right surveillance, Susan suggested. My hardware store sells security cameras. I could donate one to the library, completely legitimate, given the recent vandalism in town. We position it to cover that section. The plan was put into motion the next day. Within 48 hours, they had their answer, and it was more disturbing than they anticipated. The person leaving information was Walter Green, a county clerk with access to property records, tax information, and municipal plans. The person retrieving it wasn't a Shadow Viper, but a well-dressed man none of them recognized. Corporate type, Charlie observed as they reviewed the footage. This isn't just about drugs. They're after property. A deep dive into county records, carefully conducted by Mayor Porter to avoid alerting Walter, revealed the pattern. Companies with obscure ownership had been quietly purchasing options on properties along Riverstone's main highway corridor and near the old railroad junction. Meanwhile, businesses in those areas were precisely the ones experiencing the most harassment from the Shadow Vipers. They're devaluing the properties, Mayor Porter explained during an emergency meeting. Create enough trouble, drive businesses out, and property values plummet. Then their shell companies swoop in and buy everything at rock-bottom prices. But for what purpose? Ellie asked. Susan pulled out a faded map from the town archives. The old railway line. There's been talk for years about reviving it for commercial shipping. If someone controlled all the access points and adjacent properties, they'd control the entire commercial future of this region, Charlie finished. The Shadow Vipers aren't the masterminds. They're the muscle for someone much bigger. Miguel, who had been quietly listening while keeping Zeus calm, suddenly spoke up. Jesse told me something yesterday when I was mentoring him at the shop. He said the Vipers have been talking about the big delivery coming next week. Something that's going to put Riverstone on the map. Sheriff Davidson looked alarmed. Did he say what kind of delivery? No, but he seemed scared. Said there were new guys at the farmhouse, not bikers, but serious dudes with military gear. Ellie's expression darkened. Mercenaries. They're bringing in professionals. She turned to Sheriff Davidson. How's your contact at the DEA coming along? Still waiting, he admitted. But I did reach an old colleague at the FBI. He's interested, especially with the potential corporate angle, but he needs more solid evidence. Then we need to get it, Ellie said decisively. If this big delivery is what I think it is, a major drug shipment, then we have a week to prepare. We need to know exactly when and where it's happening. The group looked at each other, the gravity of the situation settling over them. They were no longer just protecting their town from hooligans. They were up against a sophisticated criminal enterprise with paramilitary support. Zeus, sensing the tension, moved to Ellie's side and gently rested his head on her knee. The simple gesture of comfort reminded her of Scout, and something clicked into place. We need to use their expectations against them, she said slowly, her tactical mind working through possibilities. They see us as old veterans and small-town citizens. Underestimating us is their weakness. She stroked Zeus's head thoughtfully. And we have something they don't: knowledge of every back road, trail, and hidden corner of this county. Plus a remarkable German shepherd with better senses than any surveillance equipment. Charlie smiled for the first time in days. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking, Colonel? Operation Valkyrie's last flight. Ellie confirmed, her eyes bright with the spark of a strategist seeing the battlefield clearly. Just like in '68, when everyone thought extraction was impossible. As night deepened around Ellie's old farmhouse, the Veterans Guard began planning their most daring mission yet. One that would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and the element of surprise they had cultivated by allowing their enemies to underestimate them. What the Shadow Vipers and their corporate backers didn't understand was that they weren't facing frightened townspeople. They were facing battle-hardened veterans who had found something worth fighting for once again. And leading them was a 90-year-old former helicopter pilot who had never lost her nerve under fire. The week passed in a blur of careful preparation. Through Jesse, who had been cautiously brought into their confidence, they learned that the big delivery was scheduled for Friday night at the abandoned quarry 5 miles outside town. The shipment would arrive by helicopter, a detail that made Ellie smile grimly, and would be met by the Shadow Vipers and their new mercenary allies. What they didn't anticipate was Havoc's paranoia. On Thursday afternoon, Tina called Miguel in a panic. Jesse hadn't come home the night before, and she had received a threatening text message from an unknown number. We know he's been talking. Bring $50K to the quarry tomorrow night, or he doesn't come home. The Veterans Guard convened an emergency meeting at Ellie's house. They're using Jesse as bait, Sheriff Davidson concluded. They suspect we know about the delivery. Or they're trying to flush us out, Charlie suggested. See if we're more organized than they thought. Either way, their carefully laid plans needed adjustment. Not only did they need to gather evidence of the drug shipment for the FBI, but they now had to rescue Jesse as well. Zeus seemed to sense the heightened stakes, staying close to Miguel and remaining unusually alert. When Miguel mentioned Jesse's name during the planning session, the shepherd's ears perked up, and he gave a soft whine. He knows Jesse, Miguel explained. They've spent a lot of time together at the shop. Ellie studied the dog thoughtfully. Can Zeus track by scent? He's not specifically trained for it, but German shepherds have incredible noses. With something of Jesse's to establish the scent, he might. A new element was added to their plan. Miguel would retrieve an item of Jesse's clothing from Tina, and Zeus would be their ace in the hole if Jesse was being held somewhere unexpected. By Friday evening, everything was in place. Sheriff Davidson had finally secured commitments from both DEA and FBI to be nearby, not directly involved unless evidence of criminal activity was confirmed, but close enough to respond quickly. The Veterans Guard had deployed in teams of 2 around the perimeter of the quarry, hidden in the thick Virginia woods with night vision equipment borrowed from hunting enthusiasts and communication devices donated by Susan's hardware supplier. Ellie insisted on being in the field despite Charlie's concerns. I flew night missions into hot landing zones for years, she reminded him. I'm not sitting this one out. She positioned herself with Charlie on a wooded ridge overlooking the quarry, Zeus lying silently between them. The shepherd had Jesse's baseball cap and had been given the command to find him when the time came. At precisely 10:15 p.m., they heard it, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the north. Charlie handed Ellie a pair of night vision binoculars. Unmarked Bell 206, she confirmed. Civilian model, no identification numbers visible. Pilots flying without lights. Below in the quarry, Headlights appeared as vehicles moved into position. The Shadow Viper's motorcycles were joined by 3 black SUVs, the mercenaries, presumably. In the green glow of the night vision, they could make out figures setting up a landing zone with handheld lights. Vehicle approaching from the south. Came a whispered report through their communication devices. Expensive sedan, 2 occupants. That'll be our corporate friend, Charlie murmured. They watched as the helicopter executed a perfect landing in the makeshift landing zone. 2 men emerged carrying large duffel bags, which were quickly transferred to one of the SUVs. The corporate representative stepped forward for what appeared to be a tense conversation with Havoc and one of the mercenaries. "Sheriff, are you getting this?" Ellie whispered into her communication device. "Crystal clear," came the reply. DEA agents confirmed this matches their intelligence on cartel shipment methods. They're moving into position. Suddenly, Zeus stiffened beside them, his attention fixed on something at the far edge of the quarry. Without making a sound, he rose to his feet, body rigid with alert attention. Miguel, who was positioned with another veteran near the quarry's west entrance, came over the comm. "I see him. They have Jesse tied up in one of the old equipment sheds." Ellie made a split-second decision. "Miguel, prepare to move on Jesse. Everyone else, maintain positions. Wait for my signal." The corporate meeting in the center of the quarry was concluding. Money changed hands, and the helicopter pilot began pre-flight checks. Whatever illegal business they had come to conduct was nearly complete. "Sheriff, we need to move now," Ellie urged. "Once that helicopter takes off, we lose crucial evidence." "DEA is in position," Sheriff Davidson confirmed. "FBI agents are covering the access roads." Ellie took a deep breath, then spoke clearly into her communication device. "Operation Valkyrie is a go. All units move in." What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Floodlights mounted on trees around the quarry's perimeter blazed to life, bathing the entire area in harsh white light. The Veterans Guard emerged from their hiding places, many wearing their old military vests covered in patches, a psychological tactic to create confusion about exactly who was raiding the quarry. Simultaneously, Sheriff Davidson's siren wailed as his cruiser blocked the main entrance, while DEA agents in tactical gear swarmed in from multiple directions, announcing their presence with megaphones. The corporate representative and his driver immediately surrendered, but Havoc and the mercenaries weren't going down without a fight. Gunfire erupted from the equipment sheds where Jesse was being held. "Miguel, hold position," Ellie commanded as she saw him inching forward with Zeus. "Let law enforcement handle the armed response." But Zeus had other ideas. Whether responding to the sound of Jesse's voice or driven by his military training, the German shepherds suddenly bolted from their position, racing down the ridge toward the sheds with Miguel in desperate pursuit. "Zeus, stop," Miguel called, breaking cover to follow his dog. Charlie started to rise, but Ellie grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, watching intently through the night vision binoculars. Zeus wasn't running blindly. He was executing a flanking maneuver, staying in the shadows cast by the floodlights, circling behind the equipment sheds. Miguel, realizing what was happening, dropped to a crawl and followed the shepherd's lead. In the chaos of the raid, no one noticed the dog and his handler until it was too late. Zeus burst through the back door of the shed where Jesse was being held, a snarling, 80-pound fury of fur and teeth that took down the guard watching over the teenager. Miguel was seconds behind, quickly freeing Jesse and ushering him out the back while Zeus kept the fallen guard pinned. Meanwhile, Havoc had broken away from the main confrontation, running toward a separate shed with something clutched in his hand. Ellie recognized the purposeful movement of someone with a desperate plan. "Charlie, northwest shed," she said urgently. "Havoc's carrying something. I think he's going to destroy evidence." Before Charlie could respond, Ellie was moving, not down toward the quarry floor as he expected, but parallel along the ridge toward a steep path that her tired old legs somehow navigated with surprising agility. It wasn't just muscle memory from Vietnam driving her. It was the knowledge that everything they had worked for could be lost in an instant. She intercepted Havoc just as he reached the shed door, removing a small detonator from his jacket pocket. Despite her age, her voice cracked like a whip across the night air. "That's far enough, Havoc." He spun, eyes widening at the sight of the elderly woman who had started all his troubles. "You," he snarled. Should have minded your own business, Grandma. Riverstone is my business, Ellie replied calmly, noticing Sheriff Davidson approaching from behind Havoc. And you're done destroying what we've built here. Havoc's finger moved toward the detonator button. One push, and this whole place goes up, including all the evidence your friends are so excited about. What he didn't see was Zeus, materializing silently from the darkness behind him. Miguel had issued a command, and the shepherd responded with the specialized training from his military days. Without a sound, he lunged forward, clamping his powerful jaws around Havoc's wrist and dragging his arm down with precise force. The detonator clattered to the ground as Havoc howled in pain and surprise. Sheriff Davidson closed the distance in seconds, tackling the Shadow Viper's leader to the ground while Zeus maintained his grip, growling low in his throat. Not from aggression, but from the deep-seated determination that had carried him through war zones. "Good boy," Ellie whispered, her voice catching as memories of Scout overlapped with the magnificent animal before her. There was something in Zeus's eyes, a steadiness, an understanding beyond words, that spoke of battles survived and loyalties unbroken. Sheriff Davidson secured handcuffs around Havoc's wrists as DEA agents swarmed the shed. Inside, they discovered not just drugs but detailed documents outlining the entire operation, property maps, lists of officials on the payroll, and the corporate structure behind the Shadow Viper's presence in Riverstone. By dawn, the quarry had transformed from a crime scene to a law enforcement processing center. 27 arrests in total. All the Shadow Vipers, their mercenary backup, the corporate representative identified as Jackson Wells from Meridian Development Corporation, and 4 local officials, including Walter Green. Jesse, shaken but unharmed, sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of an ambulance, Zeus resting his head protectively on the boy's knee. The shepherd hadn't left his side since the rescue, seeming to understand that his job wasn't finished until the young man was truly safe. Miguel approached Ellie as she watched them from a distance. "He's something special, that dog," he said, nodding toward Zeus. "They both are," Ellie replied, her gaze encompassing both Jesse and Zeus. The boy stood up to them in the end, told them he wouldn't help them hurt his town anymore, even when they threatened him. Miguel nodded. "Courage comes in unlikely packages sometimes. Doesn't it just?" Ellie murmured, her mind drifting to the countless young soldiers she'd evacuated decades ago. Boys not much older than Jesse who had found reservoirs of bravery they never knew they possessed. Charlie joined them, his face weary but satisfied. FBI's calling this the biggest organized crime bust in Western Virginia in 20 years. They found connections to operations in 3 other states, and the corporate angle has opened up a whole new investigation. "What about Riverstone?" Ellie asked, her thoughts turning to the future of their town. "That's the silver lining," Charlie replied with a smile. "Those property options Meridian Development acquired? All null and void once the fraud is exposed. And the mayor's already fielding calls from legitimate businesses interested in our little town. Seems our story is getting national attention." Ellie watched as Tina arrived at the ambulance, rushing to embrace her brother with tears streaming down her face. Zeus stepped back, allowing the family reunion, but stayed close enough that Jesse could still reach out to touch his fur when he needed reassurance. "We should get you home," Charlie said gently to Ellie. "It's been a long night." But Ellie shook her head. "Not yet. There's something I need to do first." 3 months later, Riverstone was healing. The scars remained, vandalized buildings being repaired, traumatized residents still jumping at the sound of motorcycles. But beneath the surface wounds, something extraordinary had taken root. The Veterans Community Center, formerly just a meeting place for the Veterans Guard, had expanded into what locals now called Valkyrie's Haven. Using reward money from the drug bust and donations that poured in after the story made national news, they had purchased the abandoned farm where the Shadow Vipers had based their operations and transformed it into something beautiful. On a warm summer afternoon, Ellie sat on the wide front porch of the renovated farmhouse, watching as Miguel led an obedience class for rescue dogs in the grassy field. Zeus demonstrated each command with military precision, while a motley assortment of shelter animals attempted to follow his example, creating a scene that alternated between impressive and comical. To Ellie's surprise, she found herself laughing, a full, unrestrained sound that she hadn't experienced since Robert's passing. The hollow ache that had accompanied her since Scout's death had not disappeared, but it had softened into something bittersweet rather than painful. "They're getting better," Charlie observed as he settled into the rocking chair beside her, handing her a glass of sweet tea. "Miguel says 2 of them are nearly ready for service dog training. And the others?" Ellie asked, watching a particularly enthusiastic beagle puppy who seemed more interested in chasing butterflies than following commands. Charlie chuckled. "Pets for veterans who need the companionship, but not necessarily a trained service animal. The beagle's already spoken for. Frank from the diner is taking him home next week." Ellie nodded, sipping her tea. The scene before her represented everything they had fought to protect, not just buildings or businesses, but the soul of a community. The therapy dog program had expanded beyond their wildest expectations, with Zeus as its unofficial mascot. The shepherd now spent his days divided between working with Miguel at the center and visiting schools, nursing homes, and veterans suffering from PTSD. Most surprising of all had been Jesse's transformation. After recovering from his ordeal, the teenager had approached Charlie about volunteering at the center. Now he worked alongside Miguel, learning dog training techniques and speaking to school groups about resisting gang recruitment. The boy who had once been drifting toward trouble had found purpose in helping others avoid the same path. "We've got visitors," Charlie said, gesturing toward the long driveway where a familiar truck was raising dust. Sheriff Davidson's vehicle pulled up alongside 3 others: Susan Chin's SUV, Mayor Porter's sedan, and Miguel's pickup. Monthly meetings of what they now called the Community Protection Council had become a fixture in Riverstone, ensuring that what happened with the Shadow Vipers could never happen again. As the group assembled on the porch, Zeus appeared at Ellie's side, settling at her feet with the quiet dignity that had endeared him to everyone in town. She reached down to stroke his ears, feeling the soft fur between her fingers. He leaned into her touch, his amber eyes meeting hers with a warmth that spoke of understanding beyond words. "Before we start," Mayor Porter announced, "I have some news. The state has approved funding to reopen the railway line, with Riverstone as the central hub. But unlike Meridian's plans, this will be publicly owned infrastructure with community oversight." A murmur of approval ran through the group. And, the mayor continued, "They've agreed to name the new depot Carter Station, in honor of our own Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Carter." Ellie felt heat rising to her cheeks as her friends applauded. "That's hardly necessary," she protested. "Oh, I think it is," Sheriff Davidson said with a smile. "The FBI agent in charge told me something interesting. He said in 30 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen a community response like ours, organized, disciplined, and completely by the book. We didn't just get lucky, Ellie. We won because you taught us how to fight the right way." As the meeting continued, Ellie's thoughts drifted to that moment at the gas station, when 3 intimidating bikers had thought an elderly woman would be an easy target. How different might things have been if she had simply driven away in fear? If she hadn't picked up her phone and called Charlie? A warm weight pressed against her leg as Zeus shifted position, seeming to sense her contemplative mood. Unlike her beloved Scout, who had been with her through the lonely years after Robert's death, Zeus belonged to many people. A communal guardian who had found his purpose in protecting an entire town. Yet in moments like this, when his soulful eyes met hers, she felt a connection that transcended ownership. Later, as the meeting concluded and twilight draped the Virginia countryside in shades of purple and gold, Ellie stood at the edge of the property, watching fireflies begin their evening dance over the fields. Behind her, the farmhouse windows glowed with warm light as volunteers prepared dinner for the half-dozen veterans currently residing in the center's transitional housing program. Jesse approached, Zeus padding quietly at his side. The teenager looked different now, taller, somehow, or perhaps just standing straighter. The haunted look that had lingered in his eyes after his ordeal with the Shadow Vipers had given way to something steadier, more confident. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice carrying the slight awkwardness of adolescence. "I wanted to show you something." He held out a leather-bound book. It's a journal of all the therapy visits Zeus makes, who he sees, how they respond to him. Miguel thought it would be good to track his impact. Ellie took the book, carefully turning pages filled with photographs, notes, and even drawings from children Zeus had visited. There were entries from veterans describing how the shepherd's presence had helped them through panic attacks or sleepless nights, letters from teachers about improved behavior in troubled students after Zeus's classroom visits, and medical notes from doctors documenting reduced blood pressure and anxiety levels in patients following therapy sessions. "This is remarkable," Ellie said softly. Jesse nodded, his expression earnest. "I thought you should see it because, well, none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up to Havoc that day. Zeus would just be Miguel's pet. I'd probably be in juvenile detention, and those people wouldn't have the help they're getting now." Ellie felt a tightness in her throat as she handed the journal back. "Sometimes the smallest actions have the largest consequences," she said. "I made a phone call. Zeus did the real work." The shepherd, hearing his name, looked up at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond human understanding. Jesse smiled and scratched behind Zeus's ears. "Miguel says he's never seen a dog bond with so many different people. Usually, they're loyal to just one person or family. But Zeus seems to know exactly who needs him most on any given day." As if to demonstrate, Zeus moved from Jesse's side to Ellie's, pressing his warm body against her leg in a gesture of quiet companionship. "Looks like today it's you," Jesse observed. Ellie smiled, unexpectedly moved by the simple gesture of canine intuition. "Would you and Miguel mind if I borrowed him for a walk? There's a trail around the property I haven't explored yet." "Of course not. He'd like that," Jesse replied, handing her Zeus's leash, though they both knew the disciplined shepherd wouldn't wander. "Just follow the path behind the barn. It loops back to the house." As Ellie set off with Zeus by her side, the evening air carried the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. The shepherd matched his pace to hers without being asked, attentive to her slower steps, but never making her feel rushed or inadequate. They walked in companionable silence until reaching a small rise overlooking the entirety of Valkyrie's Haven. From this vantage point, she could see not just the buildings, but the invisible connections they represented. Veterans finding purpose after service, animals finding homes after abandonment, a town reclaiming its soul after intimidation. Zeus sat beside her, his calm presence a counterpoint to the emotions welling up inside her. Ellie realized that for the first time since Scout's passing, she felt truly at peace. "You know," she said to the shepherd, who tilted his head as if genuinely interested in her words, "I flew into combat zones for years, but the bravest thing I ever did might have been making that phone call." Zeus leaned against her, his warm weight solid and real. "Scout would have liked you," she continued softly. "He wasn't as disciplined as you are. He was always stealing socks and hiding them, but he had the same heart." The shepherd gazed up at her with an expression that seemed to hold all the wisdom and compassion in the world. In that moment, Ellie could almost believe that something of Scout lived on in this extraordinary animal. Not his spirit, perhaps, but the universal connection that bound humans and their animal companions across time. As darkness settled fully over the Virginia countryside, lights came on along the path, guiding them home. Ellie could see figures moving about the farmhouse, her friends, her community, her family of choice. Zeus stood, giving a gentle tug on the leash as if to say it was time to rejoin them. "You're right," Ellie said, rubbing his ears affectionately. "They're waiting for us." Together, the 90-year-old veteran and the battle-tested shepherd made their way down the path toward the warmth and light. Two warriors who had found a different kind of purpose in peace than they had known in war. Behind them, fireflies rose from the tall grass like stars ascending, illuminating the way forward with their gentle, persistent light. 1 year to the day after the confrontation at Miller's gas station, a ceremony was held at the newly christened Carter Station. The rebuilt Vietnam Memorial had been relocated there, alongside a new addition, a life-sized bronze statue of a German shepherd standing watchfully beside a vintage helicopter. The plaque beneath it read, "In honor of all who serve, human and animal alike. The battles worth fighting are those fought for others." Dedicated to the veterans of Riverstone and their faithful companions. As speeches concluded and the crowd dispersed, Ellie remained seated on a bench near the memorial, Zeus stretched out at her feet. The shepherd had officially become the town's dog, still living with Miguel but spending regular time with Jesse, the residents at Valkyrie's Haven, and, at least once a week, with Ellie herself. "I'm too old to keep up with you full-time," she had explained when Miguel offered to let her adopt him permanently. "But I think we both benefit from our time together." Today, Zeus wore his therapy dog vest adorned with a special medallion. an award from the governor for his role in the Quarry raid. Ellie wore her own decoration, her Vietnam service medals displayed proudly on her jacket for perhaps the first time in decades. Charlie settled beside her on the bench, watching as Jesse demonstrated Zeus's training techniques to a group of admiring children. "Quite a legacy you've built," he observed. Ellie shook her head. "We built it together. All of us." "True enough," Charlie agreed. "But it started with one phone call." Ellie smiled, her weathered hand finding Zeus's fur. "And one remarkable dog." Zeus lifted his head at her touch, his amber eyes meeting hers with that same steady understanding that had guided them through danger and healing alike. In those eyes, Ellie saw not just Zeus, but echoes of Scout and every faithful companion who had stood beside humans throughout history. Guardians, healers, and heroes without the need for recognition or reward. "You know," Charlie said thoughtfully, "when I got your call that day, I was afraid we were too old for another fight." "We're never too old to stand for what matters," Ellie replied, watching as Jesse led Zeus back toward them, the shepherd's gait dignified and purposeful. "And we're never alone when we do." As Zeus returned to her side, settling once more at her feet with a contented sigh, Ellie felt the full circle of their journey, from confrontation to community, from intimidation to inspiration. What had begun as a moment of courage had transformed into something that would outlast them all, a town reclaimed, lives redirected, and a bond between species that transcended the limitations of words. In the warm Virginia sunshine, surrounded by the community she had helped save, Eleanor Carter rested her hand on Zeus's sturdy shoulder and felt, at 91 years old, that perhaps her greatest missions were not those flown in wartime, but those undertaken in peace, guided not by military orders, but by the unfailing compass of compassion.